It is true, I am Mr. Beat. And it's also true that George Washington is still my favorite president in American history. But why? Well, don't you know who he is? He was a great leader. And he is single-handedly the most important person to the founding of the United States.
But he owned slaves. You know somebody who didn't own slaves? Warren Harding.
Well, yeah, there was that.
How can you love a president who supported slavery?
Well, it's complicated, okay?
Complicated my butt. Do you support slavery?
No, I don't. Look, just let me tell his story, okay?
Well, it would be a very short anticlimactic video if you didn't.
Okay, here's the story of George Washington. George Washington was born on a plantation on...
Not a very good start there, buddy.
Please, just let me tell the story.
Fine.
George Washington was born on a plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia on February 22nd, 1732. He was the first child of his mom, Mary Ball Washington, but the fifth child of his dad, Augustine Washington. Augustine had 4 children from a previous marriage, 3 of whom were still around. His first wife had died back in 1729. Augustine was kind of a big deal as a local political leader. Anyway, Mary Ball and Augustine were pretty well off, but little is actually known about George's childhood. We do know that he was the oldest of their 6 children, and he spent the majority of his childhood at Ferry Farm, a 150-acre property just outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, right on the Rappahannock River. When George was 11 years old, his father died, and he had to grow up pretty quickly after that, helping his mother take care of everything on the farm. Things would not be so, quote, well off anymore. Much of George's teenage years were spent scraping by to make ends meet on the farm. Because of this, George didn't go to school much, basically only receiving the modern equivalent of a grade school education. That said, it's important to note that George inherited 10 enslaved people from his dad.
Wait a minute. He had slaves when he was just 11 years old?
Yes, just please let me continue.
Go on.
Meanwhile, George's older stepbrothers had inherited most of Augustine's estate and were still living the high life. George would visit their main crib, known as Mount Vernon, quite regularly, and he fell in love with the place. In 1749, at the age of 17, Washington received a surveyor's license. By that time, he had quite a connection, quite a person who was a big deal that could help him get a leg up in life, and that person was Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax, a wealthy politician, grew pretty fond of George and appointed him as surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, even though George was a bit unqualified for it.
Connections, connections, connections.
In this position, George went out to the frontier region quite a bit, west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He excelled, and it probably helped that he was good at math. Through this position, he was also able to earn enough money and additional connections to buy 1,500 acres of land. In 1751, 19-year-old George Washington made his only trip overseas as he traveled with his older stepbrother Lawrence to Barbados. Lawrence had been suffering from tuberculosis and was hoping the climate there would cure it. Well, it did not, and unfortunately, he would die the next year. George contracted tuberculosis himself on the trip, and later also got smallpox, which left his face scarred and perhaps also made him sterile. After the death of Lawrence, George leased Mount Vernon from Lawrence's widow, Anne. He also took Lawrence's spot in the Virginia militia, despite him having no military experience whatsoever. In October 1753, Robert Dinwiddie, the lieutenant governor of Virginia, sent the now 21-year-old Washington on a special mission. Aided by a frontier guide named Christopher Gist and various American Indian chiefs, Washington was to go to a French post on the frontier and demand they shut down the fort and leave, since the British had already claimed the land. On the journey, he was also to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and gather more intelligence about the French forces. The mission went well, and Washington's group made it through harsh winter conditions. This got George a promotion. Dinwiddie promoted him to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the Virginia Regiment the following year. Soon after that, Dinwiddie sent Washington and around 150 men out once again to the Virginia frontier to kick out more French soldiers who were on British land. However, things got ugly as Washington's soldiers forces ambushed a group of French soldiers, killing 10 of them, including their leader, Joseph Colin de Jumonville. Well, at the time, Washington hadn't realized the seriousness of what he had done, but word soon reached him that the French were very angry and wanted revenge. So he had best get ready to defend himself and his men. Washington threw together a fort, which he called Fort Necessity, but the French and their American Indian allies soon surrounded him with superior forces, and he was forced to surrender. Oh, and his little skirmish would ultimately be a big cause of what became known as the French and Indian War. Washington was humiliated and resigned from his post. As the war broke out, he read and studied any military strategy book or pamphlet he could find and hoped to one day redeem himself on the battlefield. In 1755, George decided to voluntarily serve as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who was leading an expedition to kick French forces out of the Ohio country. When Braddock and his soldiers went to the battlefield, however, Washington stayed behind as he was suffering from a severe case of dysentery. Well, things didn't go so well for Braddock. 2/3 of his forces became casualties in the Battle of the Monongahela. Braddock himself ultimately died. After Washington heard it wasn't going so well for the British, he rode into battle despite still being very sick. He rallied the survivors and helped them retreat. In the process, he had 2 horses shot from underneath him, and additional bullets went right through his coat. After this act of bravery, Washington's reputation was redeemed. Dinwiddie gave him command of all of Virginia's military force. For the rest of the war, Washington protected an area that was around 350 miles long and helped the British gain full control of Ohio country. It was during this time when George really found that swagger and those leadership skills he later became world famous for. He also never fully got the respect of many British generals at this time, who rarely seemed to listen to his suggestions. Remember that for later. In the spring of 1758, with the war still going on, Washington returned home and met a woman and fell in love. Her name was Marthacustis, and she was smart, kind, and oh yeah, rich, since she was a widow of a wealthy plantation owner. But her and George were the same age, and they hit it off. They married on January 6th, 1759. She had 2 young children from the previous marriage, John and Martha. George grew fond of them as well. But sadly, George and Martha eventually outlived them both. Martha also had dozens of slaves.
Oh, here we go again.
Okay, let's just go ahead and get this out of the way then. George Washington had control of more than 500 enslaved people throughout his entire life. Okay?
Speaks for itself now, doesn't it?
Yeah, obviously this is not a proud legacy of Washington. His slaves were also overworked, apparently, and sometimes physically abused. Not good, George. Ugh. After the French and Indian War, the Washingtons settled down at Mount Vernon. After the early death of Anne Fairfax in 1761, remember she was the widow of George's stepbrother, Lawrence, George took full ownership of the plantation. I had a chance to visit it last summer, and it is simply a beautiful place. It's easy to understand why Washington was always happiest here. Over the years, the Washingtons built onto the main house and acquired additional land in the area. And yes, additional slaves. The vast majority of work done on the plantation was by African American enslaved people. While farming was Washington's big passion, as evidenced by his painstakingly thorough records, many don't realize he was also a politician during this time. For 7 years, he represented Frederick County in the House of Burgesses, the elected representative branch of the Virginia General Assembly. Believe it or not, he got his butt kicked in the first election he ran in back in 1755, although he may have not even known that he was running, as his friends just put his name in as a candidate. Anyway, it was in the House of Burgesses that he first became a vocal critic of Great Britain's taxation policy and unfair business policies that hurt American business owners. This is probably since Washington personally often got screwed over by by predatory merchants over in London and made less money due to the British government's regulations. Indeed, if it weren't for Martha, he would have been in horrible debt. And even with his assets, he still found himself in debt. Throughout the 1760s, though, Washington was more of a homebody and a devoted husband and stepfather. Sure, he'd talk trash about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the Stamp Act of 1765, which placed a direct tax on all printed stuff in the colonies, but it wasn't until 1767 when he had had enough and became a bit of a political activist. He led protests against the Townshend Acts and helped colonists become squatters west of the Proclamation line. In May 1769, he introduced a proposal for the House of Burgesses that called for Virginians to boycott British goods. After the British backed off for a few years, they made the colonists angry again by passing the Intolerable Acts, which were meant to punish Massachusetts colonists for the Boston Tea Party protests. Well, George thought these laws were, intolerable, saying they were, quote, an invasion of our rights and privileges. Throughout these tense years, he worked with his friend George Mason quite a bit, and after the Intolerable Acts, they worked together to create the Fairfax Resolves, which rejected the British Parliament's claim of supreme authority over the American colonies. After that, things moved fairly quickly. On August 1st, 1774, Virginia selected Washington as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 British colonies to talk about how to respond to the British government just being jerks to them and stuff. They met in Philadelphia, and Washington was there pretty much the whole time. He was a good listener, and he chose his words carefully. His charisma, along with his dignity, made him a popular dude and the talk of the town. In the spring of 1775, Washington was still hoping a resolution could come about that didn't involve warfare, but that quickly changed after the battles of Lexington and Concord and the subsequent Siege of Boston in April. The American War of Independence had begun, and there was no turning back. At the Second Continental Congress, which first met in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, they created the Continental Army, an army for all the 13 colonies to unite to fight the British. And wouldn't you know it, Samuel and John Adams nominated, you guessed it, Washington to become its commander-in-chief. He was unanimously elected by the Continental Congress the next day. Washington took the job because he was obligated. He definitely didn't want it, and actually thought he was a bit unqualified for it. Incredibly, he was never even paid for it, by the way, but he was later reimbursed for expenses. No, not for that car. That never happened. That's just a commercial. Well, the early parts of the war mostly didn't go so well for Washington. He was able to free Boston by early 1776, but then later that year lost the Battle of Long Island and Battle of Kips Bay. After a victory at the Battle of Harlem Heights, he then proceeded to lose the Battle of White Plains, Battle of Fort Washington, and what became known as the evacuation of Fort Lee. Overall, Washington's strategy was to avoid direct confrontation with the superior forces of the British. When possible, strike unexpectedly and fall back slowly, then strike back unexpectedly again. Washington and his Continental Army were the clear underdogs, and, at least on paper, they shouldn't have stood much of a chance. Meanwhile, Martha Washington spent almost half the war at camp with the soldiers, helping with the war effort. The other half of the war, she managed Mount Vernon and let Washington's third cousin, Lund Washington, run things when she was with the soldiers. Also, meanwhile, the United States was now a freaking country after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, since George was out fighting the war, he didn't get a chance to sign that. And as I said earlier, things weren't going so well for him for much of the early stages of the war. However, on December 26th, 1776, he led a daring crossing of the icy Delaware River in the dead of night that. Oh, and in the middle of a winter storm, to attack Hessian mercenaries camped out in Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessians, who the British hired to help them fight the colonists, were generally hungover after Christmas celebrations and didn't see the attack coming. They were easily defeated by Washington, and what became known as the Battle of Trenton became a huge morale booster for his troops. After 2 more victories in New Jersey, Washington had a major defeat after losing the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 1777. It resulted in the British taking over Philadelphia, which was then the capital of the United States. Afterward, Washington led his 12,000 soldier army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, where things really sucked. They ran out of food and clothes and shoes during a particularly devastating winter. It's estimated that up to 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge, but amazingly, under Washington's leadership, few soldiers deserted. They stayed with him. Meanwhile, the Americans had achieved victory during the Saratoga campaign, and afterward, this convinced France to enter the war in alliance with the United States. After that, the Americans had the momentum. This all culminated with the Siege of Yorktown, a Washington-led decisive victory for the Americans and their French allies. That victory ultimately led to the British surrendering and the war being over. Not only was the United States an independent country, but George Washington was the big hero who, arguably more than anyone, helped make that happen. Sadly, shortly after the battle, Washington's only remaining stepson, John, who had been serving in the war, died, likely from dysentery. His stepdaughter, Martha, had died when she was a teenager before the war began. But Washington was not childless. He returned home to Mount Vernon to at least 4 stepchildren, who were really step-grandchildren, technically. 2 were the 2 youngest kids of his late stepson, John. His cousin Lund had lost a lot of money while overseeing Mount Vernon during the war. This left George, who is now 52 years old, in financial trouble once again. Still, he was glad to finally be home. He had been gone for so long, more than 8.5 years actually, and his health had been declining, especially his teeth. Apparently, most of them were already gone by this point. And no, he never had wooden teeth. His dentures were made of real teeth, baby. Anyway, the war, as wars do, changed Washington's perception of the world. For example, he began to question slavery.
About freaking time.
I know, right? However, even though he began to see slavery as immoral, he wasn't willing to give up his slaves anytime soon. After all, Washington still needed labor to work his farms, and giving up his slaves meant giving up all of his land.
But he should have done it anyway.
I know. Anyway, throughout the 1780s, George Washington was a household name, easily the biggest celebrity in the entire country. Every day, visitors would stream into Mount Vernon to tell him how much they loved and appreciated him. Mary, George's mom, was still alive and had moved into Mount Vernon, but was a bit overwhelmed by the place, often feeling like a tavern instead of a home. It's almost like those stalkers who hunt down TikTokers today. George hated all the attention. But yeah, he was also seen as a great uniter, as someone respected by all different groups of people from different backgrounds. This is why the other so-called founders of the country often turned to him. Washington also regularly criticized the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, for being too weak and not solving regional differences in the new republic. So when the founders decided to address the Articles' weaknesses at a secret convention in Philadelphia in May 1787, they invited him to lead it. Well, the convention ended up scrapping the Articles altogether, and under Washington's leadership, they were able to resolve big differences different delegates there had, mostly revolving around slavery and representation in Congress. During these debates, Washington realized he probably needed to make a move to show that he really wanted slavery to end.
So then he freed his slaves, right?
Unfortunately, no. But this was around the time that he decided that he would free his enslaved people in his will. After he got home, it was one of the first things that he did.
I don't understand. It would have made perfect sense if you would have done it right then.
I don't know. Why am I talking to a puppet? On September 17th, 1787, the founders finalized a new constitution, the U.S. Constitution, which we still have today. Washington was the first to sign it and promptly went home to Mount Vernon afterward. Now, there were holdouts, but ultimately, after a Bill of Rights was added a few years later, every state was on board. And a big reason why was Washington. Now, the assumption was that Washington would be the country's first president. Pretty much everyone thought that. So when he went home and went back to his old life there, literally big names like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison desperately pleaded for him to be president. Finally, George was like, okay, sure. If they want me to be, I guess I'll do it. Well, I'd say they wanted him. Washington was the only president in history to win 100% of the electoral votes. The electors chose John Adams as his vice president, and the two got along pretty well. He officially became the first president on April 30th, 1789. His mom had lived just long enough to see her son become president. She passed away a few months later. Washington moved into his new residence at 3 Cherry Street in New York City. Shortly before taking office, he'd end up living in 3 different homes, 2 in New York City and 1 in Philadelphia, throughout his presidency. Though he wished to serve without a salary, Congress gave him money anyway. He made it very clear that he only wanted to serve 1 term. His first main task as president was organizing the executive branch of the new government. He was a pretty good judge of character and talent, and assembled pretty much a dream team of what later became known as the Cabinet, or a team of advisors to help him out. Congress gave him 4 departments to be in charge of, and he chose Thomas Jefferson to be in charge of the State Department, Alexander Hamilton to be in charge of the Treasury Department, Henry Knox to be in charge of the Department of War, and Edmund Randolph to be in charge of the Department of Justice. Washington was extremely nonpartisan and strongly was against the creation of political parties, fearing they would do way more harm than good. Still, his closest advisors, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, did so anyway. Policy-wise, Washington tended to lean more toward Hamilton's policies, supporting his creation of a national bank, tariffs to increase revenue, and his support of freeing slaves brought after 1787 to the Northwest Territory. Speaking of the Northwest Territory, he did enforce sovereignty of the United States over land there during the ongoing Northwest Indian War. In doing so, he ignored previous American Indian treaty claims in the region. That said, there is no solid evidence that Washington ever called for the outright confiscation of American Indian land or their forced removal. However, historians argue about this. Foreign policy-wise, Washington declared the United States as neutral when wars broke out once again between Great Britain and France. After living through 2 major wars in his life, he wanted peace more than anything for the new country. Probably Washington's most notable presidential achievements happened during his 2nd term. Yep, he got talked into running for re-election in 1792, despite him and Martha really wanting to go back to Mount Vernon. Ultimately, though, Washington was just worried that the new country was already falling apart and felt obligated to help keep it together. He once again received 100% of the electoral votes. In his 2nd term, Washington avoided war and allowed for peaceful trade with Britain by submitting the Jay Treaty. Also during his 2nd term, Washington ended the Whiskey Rebellion, a violent uprising led by farmers in western Pennsylvania against a tax on whiskey, but not for reasons you might think. Washington personally led the army there, sure, but he didn't need to, as just going to Pennsylvania to negotiate and reason with the rebels was enough. In fact, the rebels all went home before the army even got there. After Barbary pirates were harassing American ships in the Mediterranean, Washington convinced Congress to establish a standing navy and sent the navy to protect American ships against those pirates. 2 of Washington's biggest presidential legacies came at the end of his presidency. First, even though nearly everyone wanted him to, he resisted running for a 3rd term, setting a standard that future presidents would follow follow for years to come. Second, he issued his influential farewell address, which called for national unity, avoiding joining political parties, continued neutrality when it came to foreign wars, a balanced federal budget, easy credit, free trade, and the protection of checks and balances and the separation of powers in government. In March 1797, he once again retired and went home to Mount Vernon, back to private life, which he dearly missed. While his retirement was restless, as he worried about the continued divisions in the country, John Adams, who took his place as president, somehow convinced him to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Ain't no thing, right? Fortunately, though, Washington didn't have to do much in that position. On December 12th, 1799, Washington had a regular day's work, making the rounds of his farms. By the end of the day, however, he had a very sore throat and went to bed early. The next morning, it was so bad he could barely breathe. His doctors weren't sure what to do and tried bloodletting. After losing around 40% of his blood, his condition quickly worsened. He died the next day, with Martha at his side. He was 67 years old. True to his word, he freed his slaves after he died. Well, after Martha died. But she freed them anyway after George died. Following instructions in George's will, funds provided food and clothing to his former slaves up until the 1830s.
Not good enough, dude. But maybe he was better than his contemporaries. I guess.
A lot better than Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Yes, slavery was horrible, but it's important to remember historical relativism. You can't judge historical figures by current times. You must judge them by the times that they lived in. Future humans, by the way, are going to think that all of us are horrible pieces of crap, probably. Remember, Abraham Lincoln may have freed the slaves, but was extremely racist. Extremely. Anyway, slavery aside, and probably some sexism too, and maybe some other stuff that I'm forgetting, George Washington is still my favorite president, and I still think he's the greatest president in American history. After he died, Henry Lee wrote of Washington, quote, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." Not only is George Washington the father of the country and single-handedly the most important person to the founding of the United States, I'd argue he's the most important person in American history. Many of the precedents he set are still here today. Today, hundreds of counties, towns, bridges, schools, buildings, the capital of the country, and an entire state are named after him. His birthday is now a federal holiday that celebrates all presidents who came after him. After the American Revolution, he easily could have been king of the United States. Americans loved him so much that it would have been a no-brainer. The world had known pretty much nothing but kings and dictators throughout most of human history. But nope, George turned it down. He had no ambitions to be a king. I know this is cliche at this point, but Washington knew what John Dahlberg Acton eloquently described later on, that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Washington made plenty of mistakes. He was mostly self-taught and often out of place, often with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but he was an undeniably outstanding leader. Sure, big reasons why included his charisma and command for attention, as well as his virtue, dignity, and open-mindedness. But his greatest strength, in my opinion, was that he was a uniter, someone who brought very different people together. He was the glue that kept the factions together in the early years of the Republic, and the perfect person for the job of guiding the new country as it attempted to figure out how to move forward. Simply put, he was in a category all his own, and it's hard to ever imagine another president accomplishing what he did.
George Washington, the first president, revolutionary hero.
Oh hey, this video is sponsored in part by Exter. Let me show you something. This is my old wallet. See how giant that thing is? Now here is my new Exter wallet. Far superior. Exter is the world's largest small wallet brand. There are
4 reasons.
why I like Exter. Number 1, Their wallets are slim but can still hold a lot. Number 2, all of their wallets are made of premium leather. Number 3, RFID protection, baby. Your money, your cards, your identity are safer than ever before. And number 4, this solar-powered tracker card that you can put in your wallet so that you never lose your wallet. You can connect it with your phone in case you lose your wallet, eh? Check out the link in the description of this video to get a 5% discount on your order. Thanks to Extra for sponsoring this video. So I finally made a video about George Washington. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I also finally got to go to Mount Vernon this past summer, so you saw some of that footage. A special shout out to my friend Paul for once again providing his skills with his puppet. He is amazing, and he makes his own videos on his channel called The Felt Show. You should check it out. I've linked it below. Subscribe to The Felt Show. So what do you think about George Washington? Do you think my assessment of him was accurate? Which president should I cover next? What's the meaning of life? Or just comment, Mr. Breast, give me money. Whatever, I want to hear from you. Thank you for watching.